Spider-Man. You know who he is. He spins webs, swings on them, crawls up walls. His uncle died. Oh, wait a minute, that was actually kind of mean. He's had a more successful merchandising career than you and I could shake a web at. I mean, just look at this. We've got comics, of course, and then toys. Don't forget the t-shirts, watches, plates, mugs, chairs, poppet bags, socks, shoes, scooters, hats, radios, pools, bobbleheads, Cheez-Its, toasters, shampoo, TV shows, films. Oh yeah, and video games. There's a lot of those too. But even with all this merchandise, sometimes certain products like video games don't make it to store shelves. I know that becomes hard to imagine, especially when something like the Madam Web movie makes it to reality, but that's just the world we live in. I've already spoken briefly about the Spider-Man 4 game on this channel before, but there was actually another game in development around the same time that did not release either. Game developer Eurocom, responsible for Batman Begins, Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End, and my personal favorite, Crash Bash, were working on two Spider-Man games around 2010. One was to be the Wii version of Spider-Man 4, and another was what seemed to be an original Spider-Man game for the Xbox 360. Around 2021, a very early prototype leaked of this demo, and since few people have covered this topic, we're going to take a look at it. So before we begin, it should be noted there's a menu of sorts to navigate this build, but I have to warn you, since the game is clearly in the prototype phase, it can be buggy, so I'll do my best to cover everything I can find here. Booting up the game brings us to a main menu, with a classic Spider-Man logo and a background composed of comic images. After hitting start, we are dropped right into a blank area with Spider-Man. We can run to the right, hop on an invisible platform, and see this tiny portion of a wall, but that's about it. Digging through the menu, we find this is supposed to be the Tenement Streets level. Up next is the Electrical Test Lab stage. This is a very early iteration of a room, with the floor and walls covered in a checkerboard pattern, typical of games in a prototype phase. Here we can run out of one room into another before hitting an invisible wall. The third menu is where we encounter the most interesting portion of the prototype, the Asset Viewer. Here we can view 4 character models developed so far, including Eurocom's version of Spidey, their version of Electro, a henchman character listed as Mechanics Mob Thug, and surprisingly enough, Tobey Maguire's iteration of the Webhead from the cancelled Spider-Man 4 game. Also, if you haven't noticed by now, Tobey's Spider-Man appears in the top left of the screen during gameplay to represent the health of our character. This evidence possibly suggests that the game at this stage uses leftover assets from the cancelled Wii version of Spider-Man 4. For what little is put together in this prototype, these models are surprisingly well detailed, and much effort was put into making them true to the comic while also being unique. The version of Spider-Man is so high quality that fans have seemingly ripped the model from this demo and have incorporated it as a mod for the PC version of Insomniac's Spider-Man. So if you're interested, definitely look that up. Moving on, we have an option called the White Rooms, and this is where the majority of the game demo is. Choice 1 is titled 2D Combat, where we get to test out some 2D combat. Environment is the same checkered pattern room as before, but inside we have 2 enemies using the Thug model from the Asset Viewer. The player has a few basic punches and kicks at their disposal, with a dodge option being activated by pressing the Y button when Spider Sense is activated. The combat system seems to mimic Batman Arkham Asylum, which was highly acclaimed and was released relatively close to the development of this pitch. Option 2 is labeled 3D Combat, which is surprising. With everything seen up to this point, the game has taken on a more 2.5D design philosophy. Now it's unclear if this mode was just for testing, or if it was meant to be a separate 3D mode at some point. But other than it being in 3D, it's basically the same as the 2D combat demo, fight moves and all. At this point in development, there's no individual camera control, so it just follows your character as you play. The remaining options in this menu feature similar areas, each testing a specific function, so we'll move through these fairly quickly. We have navigation, visual effects, web swinging, pickups, platforms, security devices, wall crawling, and zip lines. The final selection is labeled Art Test Areas, where we have two options, Oscorp Facility and Level Warp. These are the most extensive areas for the game at this point and are essentially identical. In Level Warp, we begin in yet another untextured checkerboard room, however this one seems to have more structure and design fleshed out than the others. To our right, there is a hole in the ceiling where we can test out our web zip abilities before hitting another wall. If we run to the chasm on the left, we will teleport to another checkerboard room in 3D, except this time, it's green. After we defeat the gentleman, there's nothing to do. It doesn't look like they got further than here in this build. Oscorp Facility is just the same as Level Warp, except without the warp to the green room, and in this one, you can actually fall down the chasm. One last interesting thing I want to mention is the title of this level. The name Oscorp Facility and the Electro model from the asset viewer are the only hints at story for this game. It's possible details were kept generic in case things transition from being an original title to a movie tie-in game for the reboot film that would become The Amazing Spider-Man. So why did this pitch not end up turning into a full game? This question definitely approaches speculation territory, but here's my best guess as to what could have happened. 2010 was a busy year for Spider-Man. Sony Pictures was still trying to get the Spider-Man 4 film off the ground, but in January decided to switch gears, opting to reboot the franchise instead. On the gaming side of things, Activision still held the rights to Spider-Man and other Marvel characters, but Spidey was the clear cash cow. They had essentially made it another series with yearly installments, much like Guitar Hero, Call of Duty, and Tony Hawk. After one of their studios, Treyarch, finished work on their last Spider-Man game, Web of Shadows, they moved on to the Call of Duty series full-time. I believe Activision around this time may have been taking pitches for future Spider-Man projects from other developers. Eurocom may have wanted a shot at this title, especially once their previously approved Spider-Man 4 project fell through due to the cancellation of the film. The pitch shown in the video would end up being called The Amazing Spider-Man internally, so perhaps this was a potential tie-in for the 2012, or it could just be referring to the character's original moniker. But in the end, Activision would choose Beenox to continue making games with the Spider-Man license. They would go on to release Shattered Dimensions, Edge of Time, and The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 throughout the early 2010s. Activision would employ Eurocom to work with the 007 license instead, who would end up shipping 007 Legends in 2012. So with all the Spider-Man games in existence, did we really miss out by losing this one? Maybe. Things are so early in development here, we're really only seeing the building blocks of a game. I can say that I did grow up playing a handful of Eurocom games, and they ranged from decent to pretty good, so I'm pretty sure this game would end up being more than serviceable. Nowadays, Spider-Man games have taken on a level of quality that they end up being considered for Game of the Year. Even if it never wins, just the fact that it's in the conversation should be an achievement. Spider-Man is such an interesting video game property because with how short the industry's history is, the character has an impressive resume already. With even greater entries in the future, they still wouldn't be possible without the stepping stones from these earlier games. And regardless of what Spider-Man game you play, it always feels good to disappear from reality for a few hours and roleplay as one of the best superheroes. Thanks for watching.